Hello, everyone. I am Frances Catherine Johnson, though folks in rural Texas still call me Fran. Now, approaching 90 years old, I feel it's time to tell my life story, a long journey filled with upheavals and secrets that have never been revealed. Truth be told, opening up to share this story isn't easy at all. My heart still races whenever I think about the past, because these aren't just simple memories, but deep-seated pain and wounds in my heart that are hard to heal. I used to be so afraid that speaking out would shatter everything, but now I have enough courage to face the past, courage to share the true story of my life. People often see me as a symbol of resilience, the mother who raised 5 children to adulthood, the wife who single-handedly bore the loss when her husband passed away, still standing firm like an old oak tree in the storm. But few know that behind all that were long nights of inner turmoil, tormenting pain that couldn't be confessed. When the incident with Tony in St. Joseph, Texas spread, people's eyes toward me changed. Some showed sympathy, some showed suspicion, but no one truly understood what I was going through and the future that lay ahead of me. Now, I am ready. Ready to tell everything for the first and perhaps last time. I hope you will truly listen. I wake up every day with the first rooster's crow, even before the sun breaks behind the hills. I enjoy that moment when the world still rests in calm and I can breathe without the burden of the day. I prepare my thick coffee on the wood stove. I've never adapted to the modernity of gas. Next, I feed the birds in the yard. I have 3 cages, a canary, a field rooster, and a mockingbird that sings so well it makes my chest ache. Sometimes I wonder if I should free them, but then I remember that a creature accustomed to captivity isn't always able to fly when the door opens. Then I tend to my plants. The ferns accompanied me when I moved to this house. Some have been there since the 1980s, surviving drought and abandonment similar to me. The neighbors comment that I have a way with plants, not knowing that each pot holds a tear I couldn't shed in front of others. Sunday is the day to receive Tony. He was my everything, was the habit, and still remains rooted in me. Sundays he invariably came for lunch, bringing with him a soda, some candy. In front of others, he was pure kindness. My other children believed he was the most attentive, the most concerned about his widowed mother. While I stirred the pot of beans, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the same anxiety that had begun that morning when I headed to Mass. Pastor David preached that we must forgive 70 times 7, carry the cross with dignity. And I returned home thinking that perhaps it was my punishment, that I hadn't been good enough, that this was the test God had sent me. Tony would arrive, kiss my forehead in front of everyone present, and wait for everyone to leave. Suddenly, the smile would fade. On the living room shelf rests an image of Saint Rita, the saint of impossible causes. People assume I pray to her for the incurable rheumatism that afflicts me, but the truth is I implored another liberation on my knees on the cold floor. When the house emptied, I would remember Jack, who died 15 years ago, a victim of a heart attack while clearing the garden. Perhaps it was the best outcome, without time to beg forgiveness for neglecting what was happening under his own roof. Jack wasn't a good man. The problem is he was weak, the type who firmly believed that certain matters shouldn't cross the walls of the home, that family problems should be resolved strictly within the family sphere. The local community held him in deep respect. Jack Johnson, an exemplary county office employee, built this house with his own hands, brick by brick, and always made sure nothing was lacking. He raised his 5 children with rectitude, except for one, whom he could never look in the eyes again after that stormy afternoon when he surprised him in the back room with me. After what happened, Jack gave himself over to drink for 3 consecutive days at Murphy's Tavern, returning home in sepulchral silence, never mentioning the subject again. It was then I understood I was alone in this trial. When he died, I harbored hope that things could change, but Tony was already an adult man with his own business and respected in the community. The confinement only intensified, the chains became heavier, and now this new neighbor appears, Mr. Ernest, who arrived about 6 months ago. He comes from the South, is a retired professor of some discipline. He started coming to my house for coffee, showing interest in my embroidery, and asking about the history of this place. At first I was suspicious, because city people don't usually trust much in an old country woman. However, There's something in his gaze, a familiar sadness. He observes me in a singular way, as if he sees beyond the wrinkles, beyond the forced smile. One day he gave me a book saying it was poetry. I laughed and explained that I had only finished elementary school and that small letters gave me headaches. He sat on the porch and read it to me with his serene voice. It was about birds escaping their cages. I felt a chill. Does he know? Do the eyes of one who has suffered recognize the suffering of others? After that episode, the nightmares returned more intense and vivid. I wake up bathed in sweat, with the sensation that his hands imprison me. 40 years living in shadow within my own house, 40 years being less than a person. Until when, dear God? Until when? The neighborhood sees me as the strong matriarch, the lady who faces life with faith and resignation. Ah, if they knew that behind this face marked by time hides a woman who has never experienced the true essence of life. My granddaughters visit me, bring my great-grandchildren, take photos with me to show them on social media, claiming I'm an example of overcoming. If I dared to reveal what happens when everyone leaves, would they believe me? Or would they say these are ramblings of my mind, that old people invent stories? The trembling in my hands began approximately 5 years ago. The doctor at the health center diagnosed it as a consequence of age, but I know it's not that. It's fear, a fear that has deeply rooted in my being and intensifies with each creak of the door on Sundays. There are days when I feel I still can't leave, that there's something I must do before facing God. I don't know what it is, but I sense that time is running out, that something is about to happen. Perhaps it's just a feeling of old age, or perhaps it's Saint Rita, who has finally heard my prayers and is preparing the way for my liberation, even if late. Mr. Ernest appeared again today while I was on the porch making my straw hats. He arrived with his usual discretion, with that peculiar way of asking permission even from the wind to pass. He brought with him a small pepper plant. The old man asked if he could cultivate something in my garden. In exchange, he would come to care for the plantation from time to time. I found it curious. A man his age living alone in that enormous house, showing interest in planting on someone else's property. However, I agreed. While he turned the soil, I realized his hands showed the marks of hard work, very different from what one would expect from a professor. I mentioned it, and he remained silent for a while, then told me that not everything is learned in books. I watched him bend close to the ground, as if dialoguing silently with the earth. He told me he had come from the south after his wife's death, seeking a new beginning in a place where no one knew his history. When I asked about his history, he sketched a melancholic smile and responded that each person carries their own burden. At that moment I understood the meaning of burden. I knew it well. I had a room full of them. The nightmares intensified after Tony's visit last Sunday. They had never been so disturbing. He arrived agitated under the effects of alcohol, complaining about cold food, weak coffee, and dust accumulated in the house. The neighbors heard the screams, but in this neighborhood, no one interferes in family conflicts. That happened before he dragged me to the back room, the one I keep locked most of the time. I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart beating rapidly and my nightgown soaked in sweat. I had the impression I was still feeling his weight on me. The smell of rum, the words he always whispered in my ear. "This is our secret, Mother." I got up and went to the kitchen. I drank water and looked out the window. The moon shone with such intensity that it allowed me to see the entire yard, the wooden fence, and Ernest's house with a dim light on. Would he also be awake, or had he simply forgotten to turn off the lamp? I stayed there for a long time thinking about how it would have been if I had gathered courage 4 decades ago, if I had screamed, if I had shared it with someone, if I had fled and never returned. But where would I go with 5 small children, without education, without economic resources, in a society where single women are looked down upon? And now, already old, what could I do? My time has passed. Yesterday, while watching the evening news, they broadcast a report about a woman who denounced her own son for abuse. The reporter narrated with solemn tone, showing the police station dependencies and interviewing the sheriff. I felt a knot in my throat. The neighbor, Mrs. Sophia, who was watching the report with me, spat on the ground and said it was a shame, that this mother was worth nothing, that a son is a son in any circumstance. I remained silent, looking at the crochet I had in my lap with irregular stitches due to the trembling of my hands. Then she asked if I was okay because I was pale as paper. I lied, saying it was low blood pressure, but the cause was another. It was as if that woman on television had achieved what I never could, as if she had shown courage for both of us. When Sophia said goodbye, I cried, hugging the pillow so no one would hear me. I don't know well if it was sadness or rage toward myself. There are days when I wonder if I'll die carrying this secret with me. I've witnessed so many funerals in this life. I buried my parents, my husband, childhood friends, and even one of my children who died young in a motorcycle accident. In each of those funerals, while people prayed, I wondered how it would be when my time came, who would miss me, and what they would say at my funeral. Dear Fran, strong woman, dedicated mother and loving grandmother. No one would ever know that I died a little each day, each time that door closed, that I had lived less than half the life I could have lived. The other day I had a horrible thought. I was in the kitchen peeling a sweet potato and the idea simply arose without warning. What if Tony died before me? The knife slipped and I cut my finger. Blood dripped onto the wooden board, bright red. I stared at it as if it were an omen, scared by my own thoughts. I asked God for forgiveness immediately, but the idea returned other times. Is it a sin to desire freedom? This morning, Mr. Ernest appeared again. This time he brought a package of special coffee that he said he bought when he lived in the South. He asked if he could prepare it for me to try. I let him. While he moved through my kitchen as if he had known it for years, he mentioned his niece, who was suffering violence from her husband and couldn't get out of that situation. I became suspicious. Why was he telling me this? Had someone said something? Had people started to suspect after so long? He continued saying that he had finally convinced her to report the aggressor, that he was helping her move to another city, and that we always have a choice, even when it seems we don't, that it's never too late. He looked at me in a particular way when saying that, as if he were speaking in code. The coffee was strong and sweet, different from what I usually drink. After he left, I kept turning the conversation over in my mind. Would it just be a coincidence, or are there things that remain engraved in us, even when we don't express them verbally? That night I dreamed of the sea. I've never actually seen the sea, only on television. In the dream I walked on the waters and didn't sink. Tomorrow is Sunday, the day Tony comes to eat. I already feel that knot in my stomach that always appears the night before. I've separated the beans to soak and cleaned the entire house, even though my joints hurt, as if leaving everything impeccable could prevent the storm. Foolishness of a frightened old woman. My granddaughter Lisa called me today to say she'll come see me after university next week. That girl is different from the other grandchildren. I can't explain it, but she seems to see beyond what I show her. The last time she came, she asked if I was happy, if something bothered me. I almost declared myself, almost opened my mouth, but I remembered that she greatly admires her Uncle Tony, whom everyone considers a saint for taking care of his elderly mother. How could I destroy that image? How could I make her also carry that weight at her age? At this stage of life, my dear, you deserve to know stories that before didn't dare to reveal themselves. Perhaps you're going through something similar. Perhaps you know someone who is. If you've come this far, stay with me, because what I'm about to share may be crucial to help you or someone close find a solution, even in situations that seem to have no way out. I'll never forget that Sunday morning. The sky had an atypical tone with dense clouds that presaged rain, although not a drop fell. It seemed that nature itself held its breath. I got up early, as usual, to prepare the lunch that had become routine. Green beans with dried meat, loose rice, boiled cassava, and that salad that Tony only pretended to eat to later insinuate that I was aging and no longer cooked like before. While I kneaded the cornbread ingredients, I heard a noise in the yard. It was Mr. Ernest tending his famous pepper plant. It surprised me to see him there so early, especially on a Sunday. He raised his hand in greeting and stayed there caring for the soil and removing some dry leaves. I returned to my tasks, but from time to time I glanced through the kitchen window. There was something different in his face, an uneasiness that didn't fit with his usual serenity. The church bell of St. Joseph rang calling to Mass, but for the first time in many years I didn't attend. I felt the need to stay home, as if something important was about to happen. Around 11, Tony's car stopped in front of the house, with the engine roaring more than necessary, as he liked, so everyone would know he had arrived. Through the window I saw him slam the door hard. He wore sunglasses, despite the cloudy day, and carried a bottle in his hand. My heart accelerated instantly. Tony drinking before eating was never a good omen. He entered without warning, shouting my name throughout the house, complaining that the door wasn't locked and that I would be robbed because of my persistence. He went directly to the refrigerator, took a beer, and sat at the kitchen table, watching me while I prepared the food. He started talking about work, how well his business was going, and how respected he was in town. Then he moved on to criticizing his ex-wife, who according to him was interested and always demanded more alimony for the children. With each sip of beer, his voice rose and his eyes became more opaque. I only responded with affirmations and denials, concentrated on preventing the pressure cooker from exploding. Not only the beans were at risk of exploding there. I put the food on the table, prayed silently as always, and served his plate first. However, Tony barely touched the food, claiming he wasn't hungry and needed to talk to me about a serious matter. I felt a knot in my stomach. He pushed the plate, spilling some sauce on the white tablecloth, and moved his chair closer to mine. He told me he was thinking of selling his house, the one he kept after the divorce, and moving here permanently because I was already too old to live alone and the neighbors commented it wasn't appropriate. While he spoke, he placed his hand on my arm, squeezing it slightly. In that way, only I understood. He said that way he could take care of me every day, not just Sundays. My mouth went dry. 40 years fleeing from Monday to Saturday, and now he wanted me every day. I tried to explain that I appreciated my independence and had already gotten used to it, mentioning that my friends always visited me. He reacted with violence, hitting the table with his fist, making the utensils tremble, and shouted that I was despising his help and showing an attitude of ingratitude. He continued saying that, despite everything he did for me, I still dared to reject his help. It was then when the kitchen door opened and Mr. Ernest appeared with an expression I had never seen before, apparently serene, but with evident turbulence in his eyes. He apologized for interfering in the situation, mentioning he had heard screams and was worried. Immediately, Tony got up and asked who this intruder was who had entered my house uninvited. Mr. Ernest, with his usual courtesy, introduced himself and extended his hand. Tony ignored the greeting gesture and began making offensive comments, insinuating that I was behaving inappropriately for my age and that it wasn't proper for a respectable lady to receive men in her house. With each insult he uttered, I shrank further into the chair, succumbing to the old habit of trying to make myself invisible. However, Mr. Ernest wasn't intimidated. With controlled voice, he suggested Tony withdraw and return another time when he was calmer. That suggestion was the last straw. My son lunged at Mr. Ernest, grabbing his shirt and pushing him against the wall, declaring he was going to teach that meddler to respect other people's families. It was then when Mr. Ernest pronounced the words that would change everything. "I know what you do to your mother. I've known since the first day I saw you treating her as if she were your property. I know your type well." Time seemed to stop at that instant. Tony's expression changed drastically, going from fury to panic in seconds. He released Mr. Ernest and stepped back as if he had received a slap. Then he began laughing nervously and forcedly, claiming Mr. Ernest was delirious and didn't know what he was talking about. He looked at me expecting me to agree with him and deny the accusations. However, for the first time in 40 years I was unable to pretend. I remained motionless looking at the ground while tears ran silently. My silence represented the confirmation Mr. Ernest needed. I realized when he pulled something from his pocket. Only later I understood it was a knife, and he spoke in a low voice, directing the words exclusively to Tony. "Now you're going to leave and never set foot in this house again. You'll never touch her again, or I swear to God I'll finish you." Tony looked at the knife, then looked at me, and let out a laugh. He said I would regret it, that he would tell everyone that the saintly Mrs. Fran was involved with the neighbor and would make me the target of the whole town's gossip. Then he left, slamming the door so hard that the picture of Saint Rita fell from the wall and the glass shattered. I stayed there, paralyzed, while Mr. Ernest picked up the glass fragments from the floor. He helped me sit, offered me a glass of water, and waited for my breathing to normalize. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, just stayed there, transmitting a silent and patient presence. When I finally managed to articulate words, they flowed hurriedly, like a dammed torrent finding a breach in the dam. I told him everything from the beginning, how it all started when Tony was 16 and I was still young and attractive. I narrated how Jack had discovered the situation once and preferred to ignore it, and how fear paralyzed me. This became an increasingly oppressive confinement, to the point where I could no longer conceive a different existence. I hated myself for being unable to prevent it, for believing at certain moments that in some way I deserved that situation. Mr. Ernest listened to me without judging, holding my trembling hands firmly between his. At the end of my account, he shared his own story, revealing how he had been a victim of abuse by an uncle during his childhood, how he had never been able to confide in anyone, and how he had recognized in me the same signs, since I carried the same marks. He had promised himself never again to ignore someone else's suffering. That afternoon, sitting in my kitchen, two elderly people shared wounds that had never been properly healed. Something tacit was decided between us. We didn't address the topic directly, but both had the conviction that this situation couldn't persist, that something had to change, even after so long. What I couldn't foresee was the price that change would demand. 3 days later, the news burst like lightning in a clear sky. I was in the yard, gathering some cilantro twigs to season the fish, when Sophia appeared desperate at the door, unable to articulate words, with words tumbling from her mouth. "Tony is dead, Fran. They've killed your son." That happened almost a month ago, but I remember it as if it were right now. My knees trembled and I had to lean on the fence to keep from falling. It wasn't pain that overwhelmed me, as everyone supposed, but another sensation I can't define precisely, a singular mixture of relief and guilt that invaded my chest immediately. Sophia kept talking, but the words reached my ears distorted as if I were submerged. They found him in the office with a single, precise stab. They didn't steal anything. The police suspect it's a revenge crime. My God, what could Tony have done to deserve such a tragic end? The world darkened before my eyes. They took me inside. They offered me water with sugar, chamomile tea. The neighbors already began arriving, that characteristic murmur of small towns when a disgrace occurs. The news spread faster than wind. Soon the house filled with people, some I didn't even know intimately, and all looked at me expecting the role of devastated mother. It was then I realized Mr. Ernest wasn't present. At the wake, I dressed in black as tradition demands. Tony's coffin was displayed in the most elegant funeral home in town that the other children insisted on hiring. A flower crown rested on the coffin, adorned with a ribbon reading eternal memories. The church devotees took turns praying the rosary. Hail Marys whispered among the tears of people who never knew what type of man my son really was. I remained seated in the front row, impassive as a statue, with hands together in my lap and dry eyes. People approached, hugged me, pronounced the usual phrases on these occasions, that God knows what he does, that he's in a better place, that he left too soon, that he had his whole life ahead. With each hug I responded, "Thank you," as if I had rehearsed it. My other children, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, all with reddened eyes, indignant about the brutality, swearing justice would be done. And I there carrying my secret like a weight in my chest, thinking that if they knew, maybe they wouldn't cry so much. Time seemed to drag endlessly, and occasionally I found myself wondering where Mr. Ernest was. Why hadn't he come to offer condolences like everyone else? Had they discovered something? Could it be that he? No, it couldn't be. He was a good man. He had listened to me, understood me. But those words he told me that Sunday insisted on resonating in my mind. "I swear to God, I'll finish you." I shook my head forcefully, trying to drive away those bad thoughts like one shoos a fly. It was a mere coincidence. It could only be that. After the burial, the house filled again with a constant coming and going of people. Pots full of food arrived constantly. Coffee was served non-stop. Neighbors took turns so I wouldn't be alone, as if they feared loneliness precisely at that moment. What they couldn't understand was that for the first time in 40 years, I could finally breathe without the weight of that persistent threat, but obviously I couldn't show it. So I continued playing my role, receiving condolences, thanking visits, keeping my eyes down in sign of respect for the mourning everyone expected me to be feeling. That night, when I finally managed to be alone, I locked all the doors and went directly to the back room. That room I avoided like the devil flees the cross. I opened the door cautiously, as if I might still find Tony inside. The characteristic smell of mold invaded my nostrils. The walls were peeling. The old bed had a stained mattress, and the curtains were yellowed by time's passage. Countless times I wanted to burn that room. How many times I thought of simply tearing down that wall and pretending that part of the house had never existed. I stood at the threshold, observing every corner, every shadow. Then I walked to the old closet and took out a white sheet from those used on double beds. I covered the bed, the nightstand, the rocking chair, as if I were covering a corpse or perhaps burying my own past. The next morning I was awakened by insistent knocks on the door. It was Sheriff Frank Wilson, accompanied by 2 policemen. Frank had been the local sheriff for over 20 years and had known my family since the children were young. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. Frank had grown up with my children. He had known me since childhood. He removed his hat upon entering, asked permission, and sat on the living room sofa. "Mrs. Francis, do you know anyone who might want to harm your son? Any enemy? Any dispute?" I shook my head, squeezing the rosary so tightly my knuckles turned white. I affirmed that Tony was a good man, respected, who had no enemies that I knew of. The lie came out easily, like all the others I had told throughout my life. Frank noted everything in a small notebook, nodding his head thoughtfully. Next he asked about the new neighbor, Mr. Ernest, if I knew where he came from, if I knew anything about his past. Again, I felt a chill running through my stomach. I responded that he was a good neighbor who helped me with plants, who seemed like a decent man. The sheriff exchanged a meaningful look with the other policeman. "Mrs. Fran, Mr. Ernest has disappeared. His house is empty. No one knows where he went. Have you noticed anything strange in his behavior in recent days?" I swallowed, while images of that Sunday passed through my mind like a movie. Mr. Ernest confronting Tony, the veiled threat, the knife. But my mouth pronounced other words. "No, Sheriff. Nothing out of the ordinary. He mentioned he was going to visit some relatives in the countryside. It must be that." When they finally left, I took refuge in the bathroom. I vomited everything I had in my stomach. The days passed all the same. The town's inhabitants had already begun to occupy themselves with other matters. Life continued its usual course. However, I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Ernest. Where would he be? Had he really been the one? And if so, why? Who had given him the right to do that for me? At night, lying in bed, I stayed listening to every noise of the old house, fantasizing that maybe he would return, that he would knock on my door and give me an explanation. I began cleaning the house with an intensity I hadn't shown in years. I scrubbed the floor vigorously, washed the walls, scrubbed the pots until my arms hurt. It was as if through physical cleaning I could also purge the guilt, the intrusive thoughts, and the confusion that had settled in my mind. My other children called me every day to show concern. The police found no relevant clues, and the investigation lost strength, like forgotten food on a plate. Joe, my second son, insisted I should go live with him in Dallas. He argued it wasn't advisable for me to stay alone after such a magnitude tragedy, that the house brought too many painful memories, and that I needed company. I rejected the suggestion every time to leave this place, to abandon the house where most of my life had passed. The idea caused me deep desperation, not so much for the good memories which were scarce, but because in a strange way I myself didn't fully understand. I felt my liberation had begun here and should be completed here as well. A week after the funeral, I received a letter without sender or address. Only my name was written with careful handwriting. Inside were just a few handwritten lines. Mrs. Francis, I don't ask forgiveness for what I did, because I recognize certain acts are unforgivable. However, I want you to know I don't regret it. I know the pain you've carried for so long, because I've carried it too. There are evils that only find their end when cut at the root. You deserve to live your final years in peace, without fears. I hope someday you can look at the past without so much suffering. May God protect you. There was no signature, but I knew it was him. I read and reread those words until I almost memorized them. Then I burned the paper in the wood stove and scattered the ashes in the yard, mixing them with the soil where the pepper plant he had planted grew. That night, for the first time, I didn't take the tranquilizer the doctor had prescribed for my grief. I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, feeling a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't exactly relief, nor gratitude, nor rebellion. It was as if a very tight knot finally began to loosen after so long I no longer remembered how it was to breathe without it. When I finally fell asleep, I didn't dream of Tony, nor blood, nor guilt. I dreamed of the sea again, that sea I've never really known, but this time I wasn't just walking on water, I was swimming, moving away from the beach, free and without fear of sinking. You may judge me as a cruel old woman for not lamenting my own son's death. Maybe you're right, but before condemning me, ask yourselves, how long would you bear living locked in your own house, in your own body, before any escape seemed acceptable? A month has passed since the funeral. Visits have become less frequent. Calls are increasingly scarce. People tend to believe that pain has an expiration date, that after a month it's already overcome. They don't know that in my case it wasn't just pain I was processing, but an intense confusion of indescribable feelings. On an afternoon of intense heat, one of those that makes us believe the world is going to catch fire, I was sweeping the yard when I noticed something strange under the back door threshold, a folded piece of paper, already a bit dirty with soil. I bent down with difficulty due to joint pain. Things weren't like before. I picked up the piece of paper. It was a handwritten message, more concise than the previous one. What was buried doesn't always rest calmly. Examine the floor of the room. There are revelations waiting to come to light. My heart accelerated like a galloping horse out of control. The handwriting was different from the first message. It wasn't from Ernest. I looked around hoping to identify who had left that there. But the yard was deserted, except for the chickens pecking oblivious to my amazement. I folded the paper and kept it in my apron pocket. I spent the rest of the day restless, watching through the window at every noise, waiting for sunset. Only when night came, and the street was silent, did I find the necessary courage to open the back room door again. The dim light of the yellowish lamp barely illuminated the room's corners. The white sheets I had placed over the furniture looked like ghosts staring at me. I felt a chill despite the heat. I removed the sheets and observed the worn wooden floor. Some boards were looser than others, time doing its work of deterioration. I knelt with difficulty, my bones protesting the effort. I slid my hand across the floor looking for a looser board near the headboard. I felt one that moved when pressed. I put my nails in the crack and pulled hard. The wood creaked, resisted, then gave suddenly. Underneath, in the dark space between the floor and earth, was an old shoebox. My fingers trembled so much I could barely hold it. When I finally put it in my lap, I stayed a while looking at it, apprehensive about what I might find inside. I remembered that in this house secrets had always weighed more than truths. I breathed deeply and opened the dusty lid. Inside the box was an old notebook of those used for recipes with the cover already detached. I recognized it immediately. It was mine from many years ago. I began leafing through the yellowed pages. Between cornbread recipes and stewed meat, there were annotations in the margins written in tiny, almost indecipherable handwriting. My handwriting, coded words, incomplete phrases, dates, a diary disguised as a recipe book. Between the lines of the couscous recipe I had written, "Today again. He said if I told anyone anything, he would kill Joe." On the edge of the chicken in brown sauce recipe, Jack realized. He pretended not to. He drank all night. There was a date marked with a circle, the 15th of July, 1985, with the annotation, "Day I thought of ending it all, but what about the children?" Tears clouded my vision. I didn't even remember that notebook, that desperate way of trying to record the hell I lived without anyone being able to understand it if they found it. It was my silent scream, buried underground, just as I buried myself alive for so many years. But who had left that letter at my door? Who knew about the existence of that notebook? Tony? No. He never would have wanted this to come to light. Jack had died long ago. While questions accumulated in my mind, I turned the last page of the notebook, and a loose paper fell onto my lap. An old, faded photograph of me, and a young man smiling with my 5 small children around us. A note written in Tony's childish handwriting said, "I'll always take care of you, Mom. I love you." I spent the night awake, sitting in the living room rocking chair, with the notebook in my lap and the photograph in my hand. Memories hit me like waves, some so painful they left me breathless. I remembered Tony when he was a child, a kind and affectionate boy who gave me wild flowers and called me Mom with such affection. At what moment did that tenderness become something so different? What happened to that child? There was a time I blamed Jack, with his excessively strict education, the physical punishments, and the example of man he represented. Later, the blame fell on myself, imagining I had done something to provoke or deserve such fate. Now, at my age, I begin to understand that evil sometimes has no logical explanation, that certain resentments are transmitted from generation to generation like a cursed inheritance. On the wall, the old clock marked time with a tick-tock that seemed even more audible in the early morning silence. Around 4 a.m., I made a decision. I walked to the yard, dug a deep hole near the apple tree that Tony had planted in his childhood, and there I buried the notebook. Not from shame or fear, but because some stories must be buried so we can move forward. I returned to the house, took a box of matches, and burned the photograph in the ashtray. While I watched the image twist in the flames, I whispered softly, "I forgive you, my son. May God forgive you too." When the sun rose, I was already awake. I had my strong coffee and put on the prettiest clothes I found in the closet, a light blue dress I reserved for special occasions. I went to the apple tree, armed with an old axe Jack used to cut firewood, and began hitting the trunk. My calloused hands burned with each impact, but I didn't stop. I discharged all the accumulated rage, sadness, and remorse. I don't know how long I stayed there, but when I finished, my arms trembled from exhaustion, and the tree showed a deep mark on the trunk. I couldn't knock it down because I no longer have strength for that, but I wounded it in such a way that I knew with time it would wither and die, as happens with secrets exposed to sunlight. The neighbors surely thought I was crazy, an elderly woman dressed elegantly hitting a tree first thing in the morning, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I was doing something exclusively for me, without worrying about others' judgment. I went back inside, took a relaxing bath, and lay down to rest. It was then I had the first dream in decades where I didn't wake up choking. I dreamed of the sea again, but this time I wasn't just swimming. I was sitting on the sand, feeling the sun caressing my face and the waves kissing my feet, feeling free. Upon waking, the room was flooded with afternoon light, and I experienced a singular peace, one of those we take time to recognize when we spend our whole life in conflict. That same night, while watching the soap opera in the living room, I heard knocks on the door. My heart accelerated, fearing it might be Mr. Ernest who had returned, but upon opening I found Lisa. My granddaughter had arrived by surprise from Dallas, where she studies psychology, and told me she was worried about me and wanted to spend a few days with me. Few days passed before classes returned, and I observed her carefully, so young and vibrant, with a gaze that seemed to scrutinize beyond my manifestations. I invited her in, prepared tea, and our conversation flowed about trivial topics until suddenly she asked how I really felt about everything that had happened to me. She wasn't referring to Tony's death, but to life in general. If I had found happiness, if I had regrets. The question surprised me. No one had ever shown genuine interest in my personal satisfaction. It was always about meeting expectations, playing the role assigned to me. I started to articulate the same falsehoods as always. But something singular happened. Instead, I felt authentic words emerging from my throat, like water from a spring dammed for too long. I told her about my turbulent marriage with Jack, about the difficulty of raising 5 children practically alone. I spoke of dreams I had never realized, seeing the sea, improving my reading, maybe even living a new romance after widowhood. However, I interrupted the narration before addressing Tony's topic. I still didn't feel prepared to reveal that part. Lisa listened attentively, holding my hand without interrupting. At the end, she hugged me affectionately and pronounced words I'll never forget. "Grandma, you deserve to be happy, not as others expect, but in your own way. As long as there's life, there's the possibility of starting over." After she fell asleep, I stayed awake reflecting on those words. Would it be viable to start over at 87 years old? That night, for the first time, I slept with my bedroom door ajar, a simple gesture that represented a complete revolution for me. Lisa spent a week with me, and during those days the house came alive. She listened to music on her phone while helping me prepare tapioca in the morning. I opened all the windows to let the sun in. She convinced me to remove the saints from the wall and renew the living room paint. She chose a light blue paint, similar to the sky's color, and painted it herself, claiming it would refresh the house's environment. At first it seemed strange after so many years contemplating those yellowish walls, but soon I liked it. It seemed the house breathed better. It was also she who suggested transforming the back room into something different. "What if we create an embroidery workshop for you, Grandma? You've always had talent for that. You could even sell your pieces at craft fairs." I knew her intention was just to give me an activity, but without knowing it, she was helping me close a door that had remained open for too long. The day we decided to start the transformation, I hesitated at the door with an accelerated heart. Lisa noticed my nervousness, approached, and took my hand. "Grandma, you don't have to do it if you don't want to." I responded that everything was fine, that it was just old age making me hesitate. I breathed deeply and entered. Together we removed the old bed, the stained mattress, the antique wardrobe. Each piece of furniture that left there took with it a fragment of the past. On the 3rd day of cleaning, while we searched through the last things in the room, Lisa found a rosary stuck in the bottom of the nightstand drawer. It was an antique rosary with blue beads that had belonged to my mother. After finding it, I found myself looking at that object that for so long had represented my belief, a faith tainted by confusion, fear, and conformity. Lisa asked if I thought of throwing it away or keeping it, and I hesitated. That rosary had witnessed my countless pleas. It had felt the grip of my fingers on countless nights of silent anguish. It was almost proof of what I had lived. After reflecting, I decided it was time to speak with Father Michael, not to confess transgressions that weren't mine, but to try to understand how the faith that had sustained me for so long had also become the chain that imprisoned me. Lisa offered to accompany me, but I told her I needed to go alone. The next day, after she left to visit some friends in town, I took the rosary, put it in my purse, and headed to the church. The St. Joseph Church was deserted at that afternoon hour. Only Father Michael was organizing hymnals for the evening service. Upon seeing me enter, he sketched that kind smile characteristic of him. He had known me since his arrival at the parish approximately 15 years ago. He had heard my confession several times, but didn't know my deepest secret. I sat in the front pew with restless hands in my lap. He immediately realized my visit wasn't limited to prayer. He sat beside me and asked about my well-being after everything that had happened. I started with hesitation, talking about trivialities, the weather, my other children's health. Next, without looking at him, I began narrating the story of a woman who had suffered for many years with a heavy secret, whose faith had helped her endure it, but had also prevented her from seeking help. I mentioned this woman believed her suffering was a test she should bear, that it was God's will. Father Michael listened in silence, with lowered eyes and hands intertwined over his black cassock. Upon finishing, without revealing the woman in the story was me, he remained silent for a moment, as if selecting words. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Francis, God has never desired his children's suffering. Men's actions in his name or using fear of him are not divine work, but human frailty. It's not a sin to seek light after so much time in darkness. I left the church feeling as if a weight had been lifted from me. I didn't reveal everything, didn't have courage, but that conversation in parables was the first step on the way back. Upon returning home, I passed by Mr. Ernest's residence. It remained unoccupied, with closed windows, emanating an air of abandonment that caused pain. I wondered again about his whereabouts, if he was, well, if I would ever know what really happened that dark night. Absorbed in my thoughts, I didn't even notice a lady had approached. It was Mrs. Teresa, a widow who lived across the street. She greeted me, asked about my health, commented on the heat, everyday conversations of country people. Suddenly, she said something that left me perplexed. "I've been told the professor felt great appreciation for you." I didn't understand anything. "What professor?" I asked. "Mr. Ernest," she responded naturally. "Before leaving, he asked me to take care of you. He said you had gone through many difficulties." At that moment, I didn't fully understand, but after what happened with your son, I keep turning it over in my head, wondering if he knew something. I felt a chill run down my back, and before I could articulate a word, she continued, "Mrs. Fran, I also had an unhappy marriage. My late husband mistreated me almost daily. I only found peace when he left. Sometimes liberation manifests in ways we wouldn't choose, but it's still liberation." After uttering these words, she said goodbye and continued on her way, leaving me there paralyzed with countless thoughts bubbling in my mind. The days in Lisa's company passed quickly, and soon the moment of her return to university approached. The night before her departure, while organizing her belongings, she made me a proposal. "What if you came with me to Dallas? We could rent a small apartment near the beach where you could finally contemplate the sea. I would continue my studies and you would have company." I confess the idea of enjoying the sea tempted me, inhaling that salty air I only know from hearing about, beginning a new stage away from so many painful memories. However, something inside told me it wasn't the right time yet, that there were still pending matters in this house, in this town. I thanked her for the invitation but told her I had to stay. I promised that as soon as I felt prepared, I would visit her and see the sea. She didn't insist, but kept the invitation open. Before leaving, she gave me a new notebook adorned with a blue cover, telling me it was for writing my memories, not the ones that cause suffering, but the ones I want to remember. That's how I began quilting and writing at the same time. The back room, now painted white and with a window enlarged during Lisa's visit, became my refuge. In the morning, I embroider kitchen towels with vibrant designs that I sell at the Sunday market. In the afternoon, I dedicate myself to writing in this blue notebook. These aren't camouflaged recipes. This time they're thoughts, pleasant memories, simple plans there's still time to carry out, like growing sunflowers in the yard, improving my crochet skills, and who knows, finally visiting the sea before turning 90. Yesterday, I was surprised by an unexpected event. The mailman delivered me a small package without sender. Inside were 3 used books and a note addressed to Mrs. Francis with a simple message, "Because it's never too late for beautiful words." There was no signature, but I suspect the sender was Ernest. The books were poetry, and one had several pages marked with small pieces of paper. At each mark was a poem that spoke of new beginnings, of finding strength in adversity, of flowering after the harshest winter. I spent the afternoon absorbed in reading, slowly deciphering the more complex words, feeling an inner renewal with each verse. That night, when I was almost asleep, I heard discreet knocks on the front door. My heart accelerated instantly, fearing it could be him, but upon opening I found the absence of any person, only a folded paper resting on the entrance mat. "There are others like us. Thursday, 3 p.m., Church Hall, Quilters Meeting. Ask for Teresa." I stared at that simple invitation for a moment, trying to decipher its meaning. Others like us. Others who have suffered. Others who have survived. Others who carry secrets too heavy. I don't know if I'll have the courage to go, to expose myself. However, an intrinsic part of me, a facet that strengthens each day, yearns to establish bonds with those unknown people, anxious to share life's burden and understand there are countless paths toward inner healing. You who follow my journey, although I don't have the privilege of knowing you personally, play a crucial role in this restoration process. Each show of appreciation, each kind comment, each demonstration of affection you deposit in this video infuses me with the necessary strength to persevere. If possible, I ask you to share this message with those who need to hear that it's never too late to undertake a new beginning, even after the most traumatic experiences. Thursday burst into my routine faster than expected. I prepared carefully, selecting the most charming dress I had, a model adorned with floral prints they gave me last Christmas. I delicately applied soft-toned lipstick to my lips. It had been a long time since I paid attention to my appearance. After all, who would an old woman adorn herself for? However, that particular day I felt the imperative need to present myself in a renewed way, not as Fran, the suffering widow of Jack, nor as the mother of the mourned Tony, but as Frances, a woman who despite everything remained vivacious and owner of the inalienable right to occupy her place in the world. I left my house with my purse full of embroidery and my heart beating at a frenetic rhythm like a samba drum. On the way to the church, my trembling legs forced me to walk slower than usual. I almost succumbed to the temptation to give up, inventing unconvincing excuses in my mind. What foolishness was this at my age? Venturing to an encounter with unknown people? What if it was all just a trap? What if they bombarded me with questions I wasn't prepared to answer? However, a driving force superior to fear propelled me forward. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps hope, or maybe simply the pure exhaustion of living in the shadow of existence. The parish hall was located in the back of the church, in a modest exposed brick building that served multiple purposes: children's catechesis, bingo for elderly people, community meetings. Upon arriving, I found a group of about 10 women arranged in a circle. Some were my age, while others seemed middle-aged. All carried their embroidery work with them. I stood still at the door, hesitating whether to enter, until one of them noticed my presence and gestured with her hand. It was Mrs. Teresa, the widow who had mentioned Mr. Ernest's name. She approached me, took my hands between hers, as calloused as mine, and led me to the center of the circle. She introduced me to the others, exaggeratedly praising my skills as an embroiderer and affirming I was the best craftswoman in St. Joseph. Such praise made me blush. The women smiled, made room for me, and soon I found myself sitting among them taking my embroidery from the bag. Teresa explained the group met weekly to quilt and fraternize. Some sold their work at fairs while others did it as mere pastime. However, there was something deeper there, something that floated between lines and only became evident as the meeting progressed. While they embroidered, they shared their experiences, not about trivialities like weather, television programming, or town gossip, but about the pains they carried in silence. Some had endured their sufferings for years, others for decades. A lady with white hair like mine, Mrs. Celestine, told how her husband would get drunk and destroy everything in the house, and how she hid her children under the bed when he arrived in an altered state. A younger woman, Marlene, spoke of the abuse she suffered from her father during childhood and her lack of courage to tell her mother. Another, Josefa, narrated how the boss of the family house where she had worked her whole life took advantage of the mistress's absence to harass her, and the fear of losing her job if she expressed any complaint was palpable. Each story shared there was more painful than the previous. Each stitch of embroidery represented a silent tear. Each line of color served to camouflage a wound that couldn't be seen. What impressed me most was the total absence of judgments or attempts to minimize others' pain. No one repeated those cliches that permeate life, like "God knows what he does," "That's the cross you have to bear," or "Women have to endure in silence." In that safe space, each suffering was welcomed, respected, and validated. I remained silent throughout the entire encounter, with trembling fingers over the quilting and a knot in my throat that wouldn't stop growing. At one point, Mrs. Teresa looked at me and asked if I would like to share something. I only nodded, indicating I didn't feel prepared yet. She smiled with understanding and assured me there was no urgency, that certain stories need time to find their voice. After the meeting, Teresa invited me for coffee at her house. I accepted, moved by curiosity to better know this woman who seemed to have such perception of my pain, even without me having uttered a single word. The house was simple, organized, and full of plants, just like mine. On the living room wall, a large framed quilt showed a tree adorned with birds in full flight. While she prepared coffee in the kitchen, I remained absorbed contemplating that work. The stitches were impeccable, the colors vibrant, but there was something singular, something I couldn't describe precisely. When she returned with 2 steaming cups, I asked about the embroidery. Teresa smiled and explained that each bird represented a woman who had been part of the quilters group and had found her liberation. Some birds flew higher, while others remained near the branches, as if gathering courage. She pointed to an empty space in the upper corner of the embroidery and said, "That's where I'll put your bird, Mrs. Fran, when you're ready to take flight." Those words impacted me unexpectedly. How did she know so much? Who had informed her about me? It was as if she could read my thoughts. Teresa sat beside me and began talking. She revealed she knew Mr. Ernest more deeply than people imagined, that his arrival in St. Joseph hadn't been casual but following a lead. She explained he was part of a larger group composed of people who had survived abuse and dedicated their lives to identifying and helping other victims. He had observed me for weeks before approaching because he had recognized in me the same signals he himself carried, and before disappearing he had asked her to take care of me, to bring me to the group when I was ready. I returned home with my mind full of questions. Mr. Ernest was part of some kind of network? Had he come to St. Joseph for me? How had he identified me? And most importantly, where would he be now? Lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, Teresa's words resonated in my mind. She had revealed that Mr. Ernest was hiding on a farm a few hours away, that he couldn't return because the police still considered him a suspect in Tony's death. She also told me it was he who sent the books and letters through her, and that he was worried about me, wanting to know how I was dealing with everything. Teresa gave me a paper with an address and told me when I felt prepared, I could go there or write to him, putting only the address of a post office box in another city on the envelope. Without mentioning the sender's name, the idea was that this post office box would serve as a discreet contact point, ensuring the connection between us remained hidden. I stayed with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time, undecided about what to do. Part of me nourished the desire to express my gratitude to Mr. Ernest for having done what I never dared to do. Another part of my feelings was anger, for having taken such a drastic measure without asking my opinion. And a third facet, the most disturbing of all, experienced relief. A deep and instinctive relief that paradoxically flooded me with guilt. What kind of mother, I asked myself, can feel relief at her own son's death? I fell asleep with that question haunting my head, the crumpled paper in my hand, and my heart oppressed by intense internal conflicts. The morning brought clarity that the darkness of night had denied me. I realized that some decisions cannot be made in the shadow of fear, but must emerge from a place of strength I was only beginning to discover. The next day I woke with firm resolution. I took a sheet from the notebook Lisa had given me and began writing. Words didn't come easily to me. My handwriting was hesitant, and the letters came out deformed. However, I persisted. Mr. Ernest, I don't know if you did what everyone imagines, and honestly, I prefer not to know. Some questions are better left unanswered, especially if we're not prepared for what might be revealed. What I know for certain is that since that fateful Sunday, my existence took a new direction. For the first time in 40 years, fear doesn't dominate me when night falls. I no longer tremble hearing the door open, nor feel obligated to hide between the walls of my own house. This for me is a gift of incalculable value, even if it came in a way I never would have chosen. I don't feel I have the right to forgive you, since it's not my prerogative, nor does it correspond to me to judge you, since such attitude would make me a hypocrite. What I can express is my gratitude. Thank you for seeing in me something I myself could no longer glimpse. Thank you for granting me the opportunity to live my final years in peace. Currently, I dedicate myself to rebuilding my life one day at a time. I've discovered that even at 87 years old, there's still time for a new beginning. I've resumed embroidery. I write in a notebook my granddaughter gave me, and I'm even thinking of improving my reading skills. I attend the quilters group weekly, where I've found other women who understand the weight of carrying a suffocating secret. I still haven't shared my entire story, but someday I will. For now, the simple presence among them already comforts me. I hope you also find peace wherever you are. Francis. I folded the letter carefully, put it in an envelope without any sender identification, and asked my neighbor's son to mail it. It was the first time in my life I sent a letter. I felt as if I were throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean, without any guarantee it would reach its destination, but nourishing hope despite everything. 3 months had passed since I began participating in the quilters group. My fingers, previously so trembling they could barely hold the needle, now danced over the fabric with renewed firmness. Teresa commented that my embroidery had taken on new life, that the colors I chose now were more vibrant and the designs more daring. However, the transformation wasn't limited to embroidery. Little by little I opened up to the group. At first I spoke to them about Jack, about our marriage full of difficulties, about alcoholism and his tendency to ignore problems. Later I spoke of my children, how I raised 5 of them practically alone, about adversities and rare joys. However, I still hadn't addressed the central theme. Tony had died, but Fran still felt the scar of that wound, which remained too sensitive to be exposed. It was on one of those Thursday afternoons dedicated to embroidery when a topic arose that would transform everything again. Raimunda, one of the most experienced in the group, shared the story of her 16-year-old granddaughter who had started dating a considerably older man. Despite the young woman's father's approval, Raimunda distrusted the guy's intentions, perceiving in his gaze something that put her on alert, a certain possessiveness, a way of treating her granddaughter as if she were an object. The other women listened attentively, offering advice and sharing similar experiences. I remained silent with embroidery forgotten in my lap. A buzzing arose in my ears, gradually growing until it became a muffled scream. Uncontrollably, tears began to roll. At that moment, Teresa approached, sat beside me, and took my hand. "Mrs. Fran, do you identify with something in this story?" I only nodded, unable to utter a single word. It was as if a dam had broken inside me that afternoon. I told everything, from beginning to end, without omitting any detail. I spoke of the first abuse when Tony was only 16, and I was still young and attractive. I told how I tried to push him away, the threats I suffered, and how Jack once discovered what was happening, but instead of protecting me, preferred to ignore the situation, drowning his cowardice in liquor. I related how little by little fear became a prison so familiar I could no longer imagine my life without it. How I prayed every night begging for my liberation, but remained trapped in chains I myself had helped forge with my silence. I explained how Ernest's arrival changed everything, as if an avenging angel had been sent to do what I never dared to do. And finally, I confessed how Tony's death provided me such great relief it filled me with guilt. The women listened in silence, some crying with me, others with heads bowed as if recognizing fragments of my story in their own lives. Upon finishing, I felt empty, as if I had expelled a poison that had been corroding me inside for decades. Teresa hugged me tightly without saying anything. It wasn't necessary. In that circle of women, my darkest secret was heard, recognized. Those cliché phrases society uses to silence women like me weren't there. I left there lighter than when I arrived, as if I could finally breathe without that weight in my chest. On the way home, for the first time in a long time, I noticed the sky, so intensely blue, so vast, it seemed like an invitation. A week after that confession, life presented me with another challenge. While tending plants in the yard, I saw Agnes, Tony's ex-wife, standing at the door. Since Tony's funeral, I hadn't heard from her. Agnes entered without waiting to be invited, observing everything around as if looking for something wrong, something out of place. We sat on the porch and Agnes went straight to the point. She had heard rumors in town that I was different, that I frequented a strange group of women, that I had received visits from Ernest before Tony's death, that some people were starting to connect dots, to suspect there was something more to this story than it seemed. Agnes's tone was accusatory, her eyes hard and cold. Next, she asked the dreaded direct question, "Did you know what Ernest planned to do to Tony?" Or worse yet, did you encourage him? A chill ran through my veins. Years of dissembling had made me expert at it, but this time something singular burst forth. Instead of the usual automatic denial, the artificial smile, the evasion, I felt fury ascending within me. Who was she to judge me? Who were they to condemn me? Where were they when I needed help? I fixed my eyes on hers and asked with a serenity I didn't know I possessed, "And did you know what Tony did to me? Because I always suspected you did." Her face paled instantly. She mumbled something unintelligible, trying to justify herself, claiming she had heard rumors, had nourished suspicions, but without being sure, without knowing how to act, fearful of creating family conflicts. The banal excuses of one who chose the most comfortable path, ignoring what was happening. Agnes's visit affected me more than I wanted to admit. After her departure, with the promise I extracted that she wouldn't divulge what she knew, I remained agitated, apprehensive. What if more people began to suspect? What if police reopened the investigation and discovered my link with Ernest? Would they consider me an accomplice? I spent the night awake, ruminating possible consequences. At dawn, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, an oppression that radiated toward my arm. They called the ambulance and took me quickly to the Austin hospital. The doctors diagnosed a heart problem, nothing alarming yet, but a warning signal. I had to remain hospitalized a few days for tests and to monitor blood pressure that had reached very high levels. In the hospital, bedridden in that impersonal bed, surrounded by cables and apparatus that emitted sound signals, I felt terribly vulnerable. The doctors asked me questions seeking information about my history, investigating if I had suffered any recent trauma, if I faced stress situations at home. One of them, more experienced, observed the old stains on my arms, the small scars on my legs, and frowned. "Mrs. Francis, how did you get those marks?" I lowered my gaze, ancestral shame resurfacing. I told him they were consequence of domestic accidents, falls, things of age. He didn't believe me. It was noticeable on his face. However, he didn't insist. Instead, he left a card on the nightstand. It was from a psychologist who attended at the health center. He affirmed he believed talking would be as beneficial for my health as the medications he was prescribing. I took the card with trembling hand and kept it in my purse without making promises. Joe, my second son, came to get me when they discharged me. On the way home, he returned with the same refrain that I should go live with him in Dallas, arguing it wasn't healthy to remain alone after a tragedy of such magnitude, and now with this heart problem, that the St. Joseph house could be sold, that the money would help with expenses, that I could enjoy a more comfortable life without worries. I rejected the suggestion repeatedly to abandon this place, to leave the house that had sheltered my entire existence. The idea caused me enormous desperation, not only for the scarce positive memories, but because in a singular way I myself barely understood. I felt my liberation had begun here and should also conclude here. There was no signature, but I was sure of the author. Time moved forward, and I continued to find my footing in this new life. The seasons changed, bringing both challenges and small joys that I was finally able to appreciate fully. 3 years have passed since that visit. At this moment, with my 90 years recently celebrated, I reach an age I never imagined attaining, and even more with an unusual sensation. I don't know well how to describe it. Happiness seems too grandiose a term for someone who has endured so much suffering. Perhaps peace is the most adequate word, a serenity that has gradually installed itself in every corner of my existence, like morning light entering through window cracks. Ernest left us a few months after our encounter. Teresa gave me the news on an ordinary day while I embroidered without making a fuss. She told me his departure had been tranquil, that he was prepared, and that he had died contemplating the sky from the balcony as if expecting something to come for him. I cried a little, but not from sadness, from gratitude for having known someone who appreciated me beyond appearances, beyond the stereotype of harmless old woman the world had imposed on me. Sheriff Frank Wilson never brought up the topic again after our conversation. The case officially closed for lack of evidence, and Tony's death remained registered as an unsolved crime of passion. Occasionally I notice a different look in his eyes when we cross paths at the market or Sunday Mass, a look suggesting he knows more than what's in official documents, but has chosen to let certain truths rest in peace. Lisa graduated in psychology and decided to return to St. Joseph, where she opened a small practice. She says she was inspired by my story, motivated to help other women who, like me, suffered in silence for so long. My heart fills with touching pride seeing her work with such determination and purpose. I imagine how my life would have been if I had had someone like her to listen to me when I was young. My house has changed as much as I have over these years. The walls that once were silent witnesses to my suffering now display vibrant colors, adorned with my own embroidery and works from other women in the group. The back room, which for so long was my particular prison, has officially transformed into an embroidery workshop. I removed the door and replaced it with a colorful curtain and installed a larger window that allows light entry throughout the day. Tuesdays and Thursdays I receive women from town who wish to learn embroidery. Some come for the craft itself, others because they've heard this is a safe place to unburden themselves. And it's between stitches and shades where countless painful stories are shared, tears are shed, and finally silences are broken. I'm not a therapist like Lisa, but I have something that perhaps is even more valuable, the experience of one who has survived the worst and still found reasons to move forward. The Quilters group has grown so much, we now occupy an entire room in the community center. Teresa continues being our leader, even at her 81 years, with apparently inexhaustible energy. Some of the younger women have begun taking the work seriously, commercializing pieces online and participating in fairs in larger cities. I, for my part, prefer to embroider for pure pleasure or to give away. My last great project was a patchwork quilt that gathers fabric pieces from different stages of my life, a fragment from the wedding dress, a scrap from Tony's school uniform, the kitchen towel I used to stop blood when Jack first attacked me, the blue fabric from the dress I wore to the burial. Each square represents a chapter of my story. Each stitch narrates a story, symbolizing a wound that, although hasn't completely healed, at least has stopped bleeding. Once, while enjoying my coffee on the terrace, I observed a young woman standing hesitant at the door. I invited her in, offered water, and asked if I could help her with anything. She told me she had heard about me and faced a delicate family situation, an aggressive husband, small children who witnessed violence, and a family that preferred to ignore the situation. She wanted to know how I had managed to free myself, how I had gathered courage after so long in silence. Looking at that young woman who could have been my granddaughter, I recognized in her the same fear that had tormented me for decades. An intense feeling flowered in my chest, transcending my own story and becoming something bigger, capable of helping other people. I shared what I could, avoiding sordid details but without minimizing the gravity of my experience. I spoke to her about the Quilters group, about Lisa's work, and about resources currently available, unimaginable in my time. I gave her the number of the support center established in the neighboring city and the contact of a lawyer specialized in domestic violence cases. Upon saying goodbye, she seemed a little stronger, a little less alone. After that encounter came other women, some sent by Lisa, others who had heard by word of mouth about a lady on Johnson Street who wasn't afraid to speak about what no one wanted to hear. My house, which for so long was a prison, has now become a refuge, not only for me but for those who need a safe place to breathe, reflect, and gather courage. On my 90th birthday, they gave me an unforgettable surprise. Lisa and Teresa organized a celebration in my house's yard, something simple, only with the closest people, the women from the Quilters meeting, and some neighbors. There were cakes, appetizers, and even an accordionist who played country music at soft volume to not bother my already tired ears. At one point, Teresa asked for everyone's attention and gave me a gift. A robust album bound in leather with my name engraved on the cover. Inside, photos of me throughout recent years. In the Quilters group, teaching the younger ones in my workshop, working on projects at the fair selling pieces. Next to each photo was a brief text written by different people relating how I had transformed their lives, how my courage in finally speaking had encouraged them to do the same, how my example of a late new beginning had inspired so many not to give up. On the last page was a blank space with a phrase written by Lisa. for when you're ready to leave your complete legacy." I immediately understood what she was insinuating, an invitation to register my complete story, without cuts, without censorship, so it would serve as testimony after my departure. Not only as a denunciation of the horror I lived, but as proof it's possible to survive, it's possible to rebuild oneself, it's possible to find dignity even after the worst atrocities. I observed around me all those women who now formed part of my life, who looked at me with genuine respect and affection, and decided, yes, it was time to leave my testimony. I didn't do it from thirst for revenge or resentment, but as a luminous guide for other women who have lost themselves in the same darkness that once enveloped me. I began recording my accounts on an old recorder Lisa kindly lent me. Every day after lunch, I sit in my studio, turn on the device, and narrate a bit of my story. I tell everything from the beginning, without omitting details, but also refraining from drowning in anger or resentment. It's curious how time alters our perception of wounds. Currently, I can mention Tony without my heart accelerating from fear, without my body paralyzing from panic. It's not that I've forgiven him, some attitudes transcend forgiveness, as Ernest said. It's more as if I've made peace with that part of my history, admitting it forms part of who I am, although it doesn't completely define me. In the recordings, I also speak of Jack, commenting how his omission constituted a form of violence as implacable as the direct abuses perpetrated by Tony. I reflect on how the silence of those who knew the facts and did nothing allowed that torment to be prolonged for decades. I speak of Ernest, of his severe and definitive justice, without exalting violence, but also not condemning a man who did what society as a whole refused to do for me. And inevitably, I speak of myself, the woman I was, what I became, and what I'm still becoming in this final stage of my life. Lisa caresses the idea of converting these recordings into a book after my departure, ensuring my voice continues being audible, that my experience continues helping other women travel their own path toward liberation. I don't know if this project will materialize, if someone will show interest in an old woman's story from rural Texas. However, I appreciate the perspective that a part of me will endure, that my suffering won't have been in vain. Contemplating the past now, at 90 years of existence in this world, I perceive with greater clarity the patterns, connections, choices, and non-choices that have delineated my trajectory. I observe how the silences imposed on women of my generation paved the way for all types of abuse. How obsession with a perfect family image, with appearances that should be preserved at any cost, allowed monsters to hide behind smiles in Sunday photographs. I see how religion, which should have been a source of comfort and hope, was used as an instrument of control and submission. "It's your cross," they repeated to me. "God doesn't impose a burden greater than we can bear." Today I understand it wasn't God who overburdened me, but men with their depraved desires and excessive power. However, I also glimpse beauty, where before I only saw desolation. I recognize the small rebellions that kept alive the flame of my humanity, even in the darkest days. The recipe notebook where I codified my pain, the whispered prayers imploring strength, not resignation, the flowers I insisted on cultivating in the yard as a silent affirmation that something in me still believed in life. I see the women who have joined me in these final years, each with their story of resistance, each carrying their own scars with dignity. And I see above all that it's never too late, that even at 87 years old, bent by time and pain, it was still possible to find a new path, a new voice, new hope. This morning, a new way of experiencing existence has been revealed to me. I woke before dawn, chose my most comfortable clothes, prepared a cup of strong coffee just as I like it, and went to the balcony. I observed how the day gradually manifested, with tones slowly emerging in the arid Texas landscape. I realized that for the first time in a long time, apprehension didn't dominate me upon hearing door noises. I didn't recoil at the sound of approaching footsteps, nor did I feel trembling thinking about what might happen. Hello, everyone. I am Frances Catherine Johnson, though folks in rural Texas still call me Fran. Now, approaching 90 years old, I feel it's time to tell my life story, a long journey filled with upheavals and secrets that have never been revealed. Truth be told, opening up to share this story isn't easy at all. My heart still races whenever I think about the past, because these aren't just simple memories, but deep-seated pain and wounds in my heart that are hard to heal. I used to be so afraid that speaking out would shatter everything, but now I have enough courage to face the past, courage to share the true story of my life. People often see me as a symbol of resilience, the mother who raised 5 children to adulthood, the wife who single-handedly bore the loss when her husband passed away, still standing firm like an old oak tree in the storm. But few know that behind all that were long nights of inner turmoil, tormenting pain that couldn't be confessed. When the incident with Tony in St. Joseph, Texas spread, people's eyes toward me changed. Some showed sympathy, some showed suspicion, but no one truly understood what I was going through and the future that lay ahead of me. Now, I am ready. Ready to tell everything for the first and perhaps last time. I hope you will truly listen.